If you had 3 months in your own DLC team, what character would you add to Total War Warhammer 3? Well, I know my answer. Bertrand the Brigrand, the grimdark Robin Hood who would come to Bretonnia with its own rework, both of which I want to detail to you. And I know the next Khorne Ogre's Greenskin DLC hasn't even released yet, but this isn't a speculation video. It's a write-up and a pitch for a mod that I've been working on for 4 years but never completed, that would make a banger of a DLC. And now I want to pitch it to you. Yes, you. You know who you are, and you're gonna like this, and if you do, steal it. I love Bretonnia. They're the King Arthur Monty Python rejects who were so overlooked by the end of Warhammer Fantasy's run that they were given away for free in the first game. Because in the later editions, they became so grimdark they lost their humor and their humility. Oppressing peasants isn't fun, but liberating them is. Enter Bertrand the Brigrand, a 5th edition neo-anarchist who lives in the forest and wonders if watery tarts bestowing nobility with her gifts is a sound form of government. Bertrand's lore is that his baron wandered off on a grail quest and left the locals of Bergerac to fend for themselves against orc hordes. The Baron's brat son refused to help further and actually taxed them harder and even imprisoned his sister for good measure since she kind of fancied Bertrand. So, Bertrand organized the local peasants and taught them archery himself. Then they drove off the greenskins alone. And just to show how terrible nobility can be in Bretonnia, that's when the Baron's son dabbled into the dark arts and summoned a dragon that then killed everyone inside the castle. But it let Bertrand pull a Bard the Bowman and put a black feathered arrow through that monster's eye. He then married the Baron's daughter over her brother's dead body, for good measure. Then took to the woods to avoid taxation and, of course, avoid promotion, fighting greenskins, barons, and bad knights with equal vigor as they're all a plague on the average peasant. And I know the Creative Assembly said they would never release a DLC for Bretonnia, but that was a long time ago, and the reality is, unless they're part of a paid DLC, they're not gonna get the love and attention they need put into them. As a DLC, this wandering horde of woodland peasants could exist as an anti-Bretonnia faction, raiding and robbing cities, then handing them over to the Peasant Liberation Front, before disappearing into the forest once more, fighting the violence inherent in the system of noble oppression with even more violence. His special brigand units could be drawn from the older editions of Warhammer and the recent Old World release, which has the same concepts. These brigands are hard men and women with no sense of chivalry, but who are well versed in killing knights. They're ambush skirmishers, crossbows, halberds, hand cannons, and yes, bombards. If it can level the battlefield by using a cheap trick that might kill a horse, Bertrand and his brigands would use them. His unique army ability would let archers deploy stakes on the battlefield, creating a pointy wall for cavalry to impale themselves on. But here's the key, he isn't actually an enemy of Bretonnia. True Bretonnian knights know he is trying to save it from itself, and in his campaign, he steals from the rich and gives to the poor. Hoarding gold and distributing alms both have their benefits. Full coffers give you access to the elite Bretonnian barons and their cavalry, but making recruiting peasants and brigands a bit harder. While giving to the poor locks away those units, but gains you the love of the downtrodden. And here's an also interesting commentary. Grail Knights would likely also only be available if you give to the poor, as back in the Warhammer tabletop RPGs, Grail Knights would sometimes mask themselves and join brigand groups to revenge wrongs against fellow nobles. Joining Bertrand would be his bosom buddies, the monk Guy le Gros, who heals you by getting you drunk on his wine, and it also reduces accuracy, which is hilarious, and the huge Norskin Hugo le Petit, who is a very big man. The unnamed Bretonnian princess that Bertrand rescued and married should also make an appearance, possibly a magic-wielding damsel of some kind to help round out your roster. You'll begin your campaign by fighting your way back from a failed crusade in deserts of distant Kimri to retake your home from corrupt lords and get the band back together again for one more gig and push at true equality, reshaping the world in your wake. That's the elevator pitch. It's supposed to make you excited. It's supposed to help you get the idea of what this DLC could look like. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of how it could be made on the quick and cheap, because if you're going to suggest that somebody take this over, possibly at a company that has the ability to do so, you got to think it all the way through. And many of you undoubtedly noticed this pitch used parts of the fantastic Bertrand in the Brigands of Bergerac mod by Maffers. And it's actually because of Maffers that I never finished my version of the mod. His version released before it, and so many of the features were the same as what I was proposing that it felt pointless to continue. He had already done it, in a couple of cases, actually done a better job than what I had. I even contacted him shortly after release just to tell him how impressed I was that this existed and to thank someone for having realized it. But there are some differences that I'll get into here. Bretonnia doesn't have tons of factions options left when it comes to units. Bohemond the Beast Slayer has been tossed out often as a lord people would like to see, but we have so many Beast Hunt lords at this point. I think he would serve better as an anti-large FLC hero for any Bretonnia faction to recruit. Give him to everybody, like a Theodore Bruckner. Bring him into your army, let him do his thing. The anti-Bretonnia idea was sparked by the excellent implementation of Draika's Wood Elf campaign and the Bretonnian Exiles campaign of Old World, which is great if you haven't seen it. I first pitched this anti-Bretonnia Brigands idea mod before either of those existed, and I ate so much crap for suggesting that Bretonnia as a faction would ever use guns. So it felt great to see the Brigands make a comeback on the official tabletop, and was a bit vindicating, if I'm honest. Building Bertrand's campaign could reuse many of the existing assets already in the game. The Brigand units could work a lot like Eltharion's elite Mistwalkers, with more units being added as you upgrade your main settlement building. The Brigands could come in various flavors, with two-hand weapons, halberds, crossbows, and handguns, or even the Grand Bretonnian Bombard, a giant cannon who shoots huge amounts of explosives but is incredibly slow to move. The idea is to give them units that are outside the normal chain of buildings, so that as a Horde faction, you always have something cheap and readily available, these tools that you can use to encounter and defeat any type of opponent. The Robin Hood mechanic I mentioned before, where you take from the rich and give to the poor, could reuse Malice Darkblade's elite elixir mechanic, which I always felt was a good idea, where you have to press it every couple turns to make something happen, but it just was never fully realized, and I think it would work really well here as a way of giving you a choice between the two big swings back and forth. The same goes for the Peasant Liberation Front, a good idea that didn't quite get fully realized with Nakai the Wander, who had a NPC faction that colonized anything that he conquered. You can see how a wandering horde of Bretonnian peasants, you don't really want to babysit that stuff, so it's nice to have someone to come in and repopulate this after you. And these Bretonnian peasants and the outlaws would be a way of adding an extra secret good guy thieves quarter or outlaws guild, where you have something to infiltrate settlements with to reduce their public order and try and force revolts. I mean, these are outlaws going in trying to destabilize society. So it's playing on the idea of cultists and stuff we see in Warhammer 3 and giving you a little more to work with this. So you're not just totally dependent on your horde. You can build an outlaw building inside of your NPC factions towns. That way you have some sort of recruitment options right there. And these thieves' quarters, or these outlaw guilds, could be built by faceless ones, a new hero unit that could come with the DLC. They're long-range skirmishers and duelists who can also assassinate. A neat party trick for all Bretonnian factions, though recruiting them would require you to spend some chivalry, and using them would probably cost you even more chivalry. Obviously, Bertrand would suffer no shits penalties. The faceless ones in the lore were disguised nobles, who basically realized that, hey, you know what, my neighbors are kind of crap, and then put on these black hoods and then shadowed their faces and then went into the woods and then led brigand units and kind of fought against themselves in a sort of ironic way. And you'll notice Bertrand is pretty straightforward. Not every lord needs an overly complicated bespoke mechanic with 13 different resources to manage. Sometimes you just want to play a campaign that is a very specific class fantasy, and the Robin Hood is a definite archetype. And when accompanied with a rework of Bretonnia's other systems, Bretonnia could feel quite fresh in Bertrand and yours hands, but we'll get to those in a moment. For other units, there's some pretty obvious ones we see in all the Bretonnia mods. Foot Knights are an obvious inclusion. inclusion. Dismounted nobles who recently appeared in Old World and would act much the same as any high-tiered Bretonnian infantry unit. They're there to hold the line. I prefer a similar role of this extra elite infantry to be filled by hermit knights. 5 exceedingly old paladins who walk around and then buff nearby units and heal themselves through most injuries due to their, blessed blood. Think that old codger from Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade. They aren't top-tier high infantry. They're more like crypt horrors. They're there to absorb some of the meat. They're like a troll sort of unit for Bretonnia, as opposed to just more foot knights. Hunting hounds could be a very cool inclusion and are a Bretonnian version of wolves, except, they're big dogs with a bit of armor. And the idea for them actually comes from sketches for an unreleased Bretonnia book back from Warhammer Fantasy. And they even have a cool Regiment of Renown version, the Truffle Hounds, which are dogs that would go crazy from the smell of truffles and just attack people, just like doing anything to try and get to them. And it would give the dogs frenzy for a short time. Grail reliquaries have always underperformed in my idea. They're supposed to be these great big things that focus peasants in, but they never seem to do what you want. So I think Grail shrines, which would be the next tier of a Grail reliquary, would be very cool to see on the battlefield. And we're seeing a lot more shrines and things like that coming in right now with the Chaos faction. So it makes sense to sort of keep in that same theme here, as the shrines give you more reason to keep using early low-tier peasant-style units further into the game. Haramalts are brigands for everybody else. They skirmish around like Empire Huntsmen, and they shoot and they move and they can do things besides just stand there like your average Bretonnian peasant bowman. Their Regiment of Renown could be the Merry Men, which, yes, are dressed in green and are actually in the lore. Bertrand and his Merry Men of Bergerac were featured in a White Dwarf article, and, as you might guess, are a lot of the crux of this original idea here. For a general rework, Bretonnia needs some help, let's be honest here, and it specifically needs help with peasants, the Green Knight, and crusades, or errantry wars, whatever you want to call them. I've discussed my idea for a Bretonnia rework previously in a podcast with Monsters Abound, Nerd Rage Fred, and Colonel Damders, and was met with a sea of nodding heads of sage-like wisdom. So I assume I'm onto something here. The problem with Bretonnia in its current peasant system is that it's boring. Just basically completely unimpactful. I propose moving the peasant economy with a minor tweak to something like the old Harmony system for Cathay, which in itself is sort of based on the peasant recruitment system or the feared recruitment system from Thrones of Britannia. So the more peasants you have in your army, right, the more control you have in your provinces, because peasants make a lot of problems, and if you have them in the armies, they're not making problems. But the less money your provinces would make because they're not in the farms. You can recruit less peasants and get more money, but then also your control drastically drops as the dirty buggers are getting around causing problems and getting disgruntled, and there's so many of them they multiply like rabbits, and you can see how this works because they don't know their place, and eventually they're going to cause a bunch of uproar. And now you can see how this ties back into the Bertrand the Brigrand campaign idea of you gotta keep the peasants busy or risk peasant revolts, which has some fun historical precedents as well. But it makes you have a choice in your campaign. You either have to control the peasants or utilize them in your armies and take the hit. And there's not a one or the other, it's a flow back and forth between the two. Many want to see the Green Knight as a permanent hero that you can unlock. I'd much rather he be a battle spell. In lore, he appears when Bretonnians are in the direst straits and they need help to tip the scales of the battle in their favor. And then he sods off right again after to be disappeared back into the forest. So having him kept around to just, follow you and do your bidding is a bit odd. I don't care for that. I'd much rather see him as a battle spell where, ironically, if you lose too many people in battle, you get the ability to summon him, like the ultimate tide turner, riding in with his verdant blade held high. Or maybe there's a possibility where he can appear as a reinforcement, just randomly. The reinforcement system exists. You go into a battle, and if you're outnumbered, there's a chance he'll just pop up and then reinforce you 30 seconds into the battle. I really like the idea, like a one-man army shows up, and it's like, oh, something's coming to help us. Could it be the Green Knight sallies forth? Again, thematic, right? Now, speaking of riding in, this is a personal pet peeve. The unit count of Grail Knights and Grail Guardians is way too high. There's like, what, 30 or 60 guys on Ultra that are supposed to be Grail Knights? These are the elitist of the elite. You know, having them just as another tier of cavalry doesn't make them feel unique, and it doesn't really lean into that. That strong, almost monstrous cavalry is missing from them. So reducing their unit count, but increasing their power to be something more like the Chaos equivalent, I think would go a long way. And there's a lot of mods that do that, and I play with them all the time. The final missing bit, though, is Crusades. It's no secret that Bretonnia is based on medieval Frankish armies, and a cornerstone of that was Crusades, where you go, take your army to a faraway place, conquer it, and then come back. It's a core part of Bretonnia, and it is a sorely missed way of gaining outside targets. I mean, in practice, it would work a lot like a WA for greenskins. You call a target, and your army grows with you, with other Bretonnians joining you as you move towards the target. And if you capture the target city, you gain a huge amount of chivalry and some gold and some fun units or items or something. You know, it's the WA system over again, right? The point is, the system is already there, and with a few tweaks would work wonderfully to give Bretonnia a reason to leave its homeland and then come back again, right? And that also allows people like Bertrand a way of confederating with Bretonnia factions that, you know, he's fighting some but not the other. And while we're at it, let's add some more Val choices. Let's make these a little more impactful so you don't just feel like there's one you need to do. You're always upgrading to the next. Let's have each one feel like a definite choice like you would have on the tabletop. Crusaders, Errantry, Exiles, you know, there's a lot of options here. And that's my idea for a Bretonnia DLC, which nobody asked for. And it may seem odd to release this now, but Slaanesh is the next likely DLC, and Bertrand the Brigand's last act in the lore in the end times was to defend a castle against a Keeper of Secrets demon, and then put his black arrow through its eye socket and send that Slaaneshi demon back to his astral pleasure palace. It's just less of a punishment and more of a fast pass back to pleasure, you know, now that I've said it aloud. But there's always a fun connection in there, and when one DLC wraps up, the work on the next one begins, so I hope this one reaches some interested ears before we get there. You never know what people might like. The other version of a Bretonnia DLC is Malobod, but he's really a Vampire Count's Lord, and I'll save him for another day. So if you liked this concept of just, hey, if you got to make a DLC, what would it look like? I'd love to keep making them, because man, I've got some ideas, and there's some really cool, fun stuff out there, and that's what I want at the end of the day, is to craft something fun that both you and I could enjoy. So here's hoping we see our favorite Robin Hood reject in the future, Bertrand the Brigand, and his Bretonnians with a much-needed Bretonnia rework. But as always, even if that doesn't happen, I look forward to seeing what comes next, and I look forward to seeing it with you. So, thanks for watching.